Yeah, and Richard.
Okay, we are recording. Welcome everyone to the weekly Cluster API office hours community meeting. It is Wednesday, April 6th. We abide by the CNCF code of conduct, so please be kind to one another. Raise hands if you'd like to speak. And without further ado, I'm going to go through the agenda here. So the first thing we want to do is, actually, I'm going to flip the agenda. Can we welcome new attendees first? If you're new to the Cluster API community, or if you're new to this meeting, or if for any reason you'd like to just say hi and introduce yourself so folks can put names to faces, please take the opportunity right now to do so. Okay, fair enough. Open. Oh yes, welcome.
Yeah, thanks.
The floor is yours.
I'm from Nutanix, and we just added our Nutanix cluster provider, so we are also in the development of that.
Thanks for saying hi. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, counting down 3, 2, 1. Great. Okay, open proposal readout. So I'm going to click through the link because it is a link. Is this a screen share responsibility?
Check. Do you want to share your screen? Just asking.
I can. Oh, I should share this, shouldn't I? Let's see.
Yep.
Okay, good deal. All right, so looks like we've got a little picture-in-picture here, so we can. Is this the active list of open proposals? Can you folks see my Safari browser with the Google Doc?
Yeah, I can see it. Also, just FYI, Matt has his hand up.
I see that. Matt, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. For some reason, your little preview there is kind of stale. It's not actually up to date. But I was just going to point out we all made some more updates to the machine pool machines. I think we've caught up with almost all the feedback. We're hoping we're at a point pretty soon where we can enter lazy consensus, but please have a look. The main change we made recently was simplifying things, so we're only going to use a selector rather than the other associated fields, and that's going to be on the provider machine pool status struct. So anyway, thank you. Take a look, and hopefully we're nearing consensus. That's all.
Okay, Yuvaraj, sorry if I said your name wrong. You're up.
No, that pronunciation is correct. I added an entry to the open proposals for the runtime hooks for add-on management, and if folks are okay with it, we can take a look at it right now.
Think so?
Okay. Can I share my screen?
Let me stop sharing.
I think I need to be co-host.
Do you have permission?
Just made you co-host. You probably should be good now.
Thanks, Cecile.
Thank you. Can everyone see the Google Doc?
I can see it.
I think so, yes.
Okay, awesome. So this is the Cluster API runtime hooks for add-on management proposal. This builds on top of the runtime SDK proposal that was recently merged. Killian did go through and provide a preview of this proposal in last week's office hours, but this proposal is now shared and available to everyone in the community. We'll go through the proposal and see and try to answer any questions that there are right now. But of course, feel free to take a look at it afterwards and please leave your comments on it. So first thing, the motivation behind the whole proposal is to enable add-on management systems to hook into cluster lifecycle events to have better control on what they want to do with the add-ons. Examples are operations that you would want to do on an add-on, on installing add-ons while you're provisioning your cluster, operations that you would want to do regarding upgrading your add-ons when the cluster upgrade flow is triggered, and operations that you would want to do when deleting or doing operations on your add-ons when the cluster delete workflow is triggered. Right now, these things are not quite possible by writing your own external controller and so on, because you cannot hook into the exact moments in the cluster lifecycle that you really care about. And this proposal introduces the concept of runtime hooks, which, as I mentioned, builds on top of runtime SDK, which allows you to basically hook into those runtime lifecycle events for a cluster and then perform operations on top of it. Even though the proposal right now is documented as using these runtime hooks for add-on management, the runtime hooks actually solve or modeled against common events that they can be used for cases beyond add-on management. And it could be used for anything else, and the proposal does not make any limitations on using it only for add-on management. But right now it is framed for using add-on management as an example to show how runtime hooks could be used. Now, as far as the goals of this proposal goes, in this proposal, we want to identify a set of runtime hooks that could be used and define the schemas associated with the runtime hooks. That would be the request response schemas, and also identify the moment in the cluster lifecycle when these corresponding runtime hooks will be called or executed. And as far as non-goals go, this proposal is going to just list a subset of runtime hooks that would eventually come up in cluster API. This is not an exhaustive list of all the runtime hooks that cluster API will ever support. And this proposal does not aim to provide a full solution for add-on management. This proposal only talks about the runtime hooks and just provides use cases for add-on management, but this does not cover detailed solutions for add-on management problems like migrating CPI from in-tree to out-of-tree and other stuff like that. Okay, if you jump into the body of the proposal itself, the runtime hooks are proposed to be supported only for clusters that are based out of cluster class, basically clusters with managed topologies. And the reason behind that is clusters with managed topologies have this overarching view of the cluster and its lifecycle, and also have some amount of control on the underlying objects. Therefore, the ability to be able to provide runtime hooks becomes obvious when you're using clusters with managed topologies. And in classic clusters, the ones that do not use managed topologies, since no specific reconciler or no specific controller has an overarching view of the entire process, it becomes a little tricky. So for the purposes of this proposal, we're going to limit it down to only clusters with managed topologies, that is clusters based out of cluster classes. And the proposal does document why we did this, so please do take a look if you have any further questions on that. Going further down, here, this proposal introduces six runtime hooks, and we have use cases, we have example use cases for each of them. For example, if you want to be able to perform certain actions. So let's take the metrics database as an example of an add-on that we want to care about, that we want to operate on using the runtime hooks. So let's say you want to be able to check if there is enough disk space for you to be able to persist the metrics, then you would want to do certain actions before your cluster is created. And let's say after your control plane is initialized, you want to check if the metrics database is also available. And let's say when you trigger your cluster upgrade, you also want to be able to pump the version or change the version of the metric server associated, and so on. So there are a few use cases listed down here, and each of them talk about certain actions that you can do with an add-on, or certain actions that you can do when associated with a runtime hook. So let's take a closer look at the 6 runtime hooks that we are introducing in this proposal. This shows a timeline. This diagram shows a timeline for cluster. This was presented last week as well, but we'll go through it again. The items above the blue line talk about the events that are happening on the cluster, and the items below the blue line are the lifecycle, the runtime hooks that get called. So let's say a user creates a cluster, since this is a managed cluster. Before any of the underlying objects like the cluster, the infrastructure cluster, the control plane, or the machine deployments are created, we do trigger something called a before cluster create hook. And once this resolves to success, the cluster provisioning will start. And let's say at some point after that, the first API server of the control plane is available, then the control plane, then we trigger the after control plane initialized hook. And at some point in the future, let's say the user upgrades the cluster. Before this new version is propagated to any of the underlying objects like the control plane or the workers, the before cluster upgrade hook is then triggered. We'll take a closer look at how the request and response of these hooks are going to look like in a second. And after a while, let's say the control plane finishes upgrading, then we trigger the after control upgrade hook. And after that succeeds, let's say all the workers finish upgrading, then we trigger the after cluster upgrade hook. And at some point, let's say the user deletes the cluster. Again, before any of the underlying objects of the cluster are deleted, the before cluster delete hook is then called, and then the user can take, and then the extension author can take actions depending on the hook and the request passed along with the hook. So taking a closer look at the runtime hooks itself. So for each runtime hook, this proposal describes or specifies how the request for the hook and the response for the hook is going to look like. For example, the before cluster upgrade hook has a before cluster create, the before cluster create hook has a before cluster create request. And in that we send the cluster object. And this is the minimal information that we are sending right now, just the cluster object, because all the extension controllers or the extension authors would probably need this as a minimum information to make decisions on top of it. So the object that we are sending right now is just the cluster object. And as a response, the hook could get a response similar to this, which is a before cluster create response. And you can see that it also could potentially send back something called a retry after seconds. And this signifies to the runtime hook that the user wants to block the operation and then retry after a while. And this response basically says that the hook should be called sometime within the next, will be called sometime within the next 10 seconds. So runtime SDK proposal introduced this concept of blocking and non-blocking hooks. So the before cluster create hook is an example of a blocking hook where the extension author can send back a response, which then blocks the cluster create operation for a certain time, and then it retries after a certain time, and then it re-executes that hook. And then the extension author can then reevaluate and then decide if it needs to be, if it can then succeed at that point, or if it needs more time. Let's take a look at the after control plane initialized hook. This also has a similar request, so after control plane initialized request, along with in which we just send the cluster object. But if you take a look at the response here, we do not have a retry after seconds as one of the response parameters. And this is an example of a non-blocking hook, because this is an after cluster initialized. So the cluster is already initialized. The control plane is already initialized. There is nothing that you can technically block as far as initialization goes. So this is an example for a hook that does not block the reconciliation, but does call external extensions that could use the event that the control plane was initialized. And now let's take a look at the before cluster upgrade hook. The next three hooks will talk specifically about the upgrade flow associated with the cluster's lifecycle. And in this case, we again have a before cluster upgrade a request in which we send the cluster object, but in this case, we also send the from Kubernetes version and the to Kubernetes version associated with it. These values are the versions associated with the corresponding upgrade operation for that cluster. And as you can see, the response does support retry after seconds, indicating that it is a blocking response. But the thing to note is, in this case, because this is an upgrade hook, if a hook does return a retry after seconds, it would only block the upgrade operation, but the rest of the reconciliation will go through normally, right? So if there are other reconciliation operations like scale of the worker nodes or scale of the control plane, then those will go through and reconcile normally, and those operations will not be blocked. So this only blocks the upgrade flow. And similarly, we have an after control plane upgrade hook, which also gets the cluster object. And since this is an after hook, we only have the Kubernetes 1 version, which is the Kubernetes version, which is the upgraded version of the control plane at this point. And this can also send back a retry after seconds. This response can also send back a retry after seconds. And in this case, it would block the upgrade of the workers at that point. It will finish the upgrade of the control. This is called after the control plane is finished upgrading, but then it will block the upgrade of the worker nodes. And then we have an after cluster upgrade hook, which does not have a retry after second, so it is non-blocking, and it also takes a cluster object as a cluster object and the Kubernetes version in its request object. And the last hook that we have is the before cluster delete hook. This, as the name suggests, is used while the cluster is triggered when the cluster is being deleted. And again, this is also a blocking hook where the user can send back a retry after seconds in the response, and it would block the deletion of the cluster. There is a draft OpenAPI spec linked in the doc that you can take a look at. It talks about all the 6 hooks that we described in the proposal, and also gives you the schemas associated with the request and response objects. So please do take a look at the SDK of the draft OpenAPI spec as well. Moving on, we have some notes about how extensions that could consume these runtime hooks should be when basically providing developer guide for extension authors to think about while writing extensions that consume these runtime hooks. And most of the guidelines that were defined in the runtime SDK do apply here, but we are specifically calling out certain things, certain points from the runtime SDK. And those are things to note when writing extensions that could be blocking and non-blocking, and stuff about error, specifically caring about error management and how these runtime hooks, when combined with failure policy, can affect how the reconciliation of an object of the cluster is going to happen, and also general guidance about avoiding dependencies between extensions itself. Like you would not want to have one extension depend on another extension being executed, and so on. And more details about these developer guide points are listed in the runtime SDK proposal, and you have links in this proposal, so you can just go back and take a look at that. Going further down, we just listed down the security model, the risks and mitigations. The security model again also shares most of its principles from the runtime SDK proposal. Same goes with risks and mitigations. And that is basically the end of the proposal. I'll pause here to answer any questions if there are.
Thank you, Yuvraj. So I don't see any hands raised, so I'll ask a question. Thanks for the detailed presentation. Jonathan Tong and I are actually going to be working with Fabrizio on his add-ons orchestration proposal, which it sounds like would benefit from these runtime hooks. So this is this seems really promising. I would maybe suggest if we could get a concrete use case in here instead of a sort of hand wavy add-ons use case, because there are no add-ons in Cluster API is still abstract and sort of aspirational. Would it be possible to make the use case that we're referring to in this document a little bit more concrete, or do we feel like there really isn't any known working solution that we could tie into this until we have an add-ons implementation? Does that make sense?
Yes. Since this proposal focuses on runtime hooks, adding a specific example for an add-on management. Oh, I see Fabrizio raised his hand. So go ahead, Fabrizio.
So the use case that we have today are about a metric database. So it is already a kind of a real use case. If you have in mind others, we can add more. Please make us a comment. That makes sense.
Would they be implemented as CRS in the current use case? Cluster resource set, sorry.
No. This is basically what we are saying is that if you want to manage your metric system, these hooks can help you. But we are not entering, the proposal is not entering into the detail on how you manage your metric system. And,
that makes sense.
And this is the space for the other document.
That makes sense. Okay, cool. So I haven't come prepared to talk about your proposal, Fabrizio, for add-ons orchestration. So we'll do that in the next couple of weeks when we've synced up. But this is really great level of detail. This proposal looks like it's undergone a lot of work, so thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I don't see any hands raised. So in the interest of getting all the agenda items included in this discussion, I think I will move to the agenda part of, I'll share screen again. Move to the agenda. You can do it, Zoom.
It looks like people may be adding items.
People. I'm just joking. All right. First on the list is Matt with Machine Pool Machines. Matt, you want to take a few minutes?
Oh, that's me taking notes.
Yeah, no, I already kind of flew over that, I think.
So you feel like we're good for that?
Yeah, I think this is just Fabrizio was writing down that I mentioned that we updated Machine Pool Machines.
Okay, great.
We're good.
So to folks who are interested in that effort, I see a PTAL note there. So PTAL. Stefan, do you want to take the floor for unknown fields and cluster variables? Do you need to screen share?
No, you can just open the link and scroll down. That's fine.
Fair enough. All right.
Okay, so
make it a little bigger.
Yep, that's perfect. Okay, so just some context first. So it's about cluster class or cluster variables. The situation today is the following. In a cluster class, you can define a variable which is an object, and you can opt to just not define any schema at all. So you just say type object, and then you can fill in random objects, whatever you want. So just like that example here a little bit at the bottom of the screen. So just some random object, something like that just works. That's not ideal because if your patches or later on external patching is relying on a certain format, yeah, you won't be able to work with that kind of data. The problem is just we essentially missed to prune those fields. So in Kubernetes, or to validate those fields. So in Kubernetes, there's something like pruning. So if you do that with a CRD, those fields per default are just getting implicitly pruned. And now we're in a situation where we have type object, and the default behavior is that we're just keeping those fields, we're storing them in etcd. They might not adhere to any schema at all, they're just there. And that issue is about what do we want to do with the current state, and where do we want to get to, and I will just go over it, and then we can, I don't know if someone has spontaneous opinions, that's fine. Otherwise, we can just discuss on the issue. What I would suggest is, can you scroll up a little bit? What I would suggest is that we switch to an explicit opt-in. So essentially, if you want to have we call it here, free-form object, then you would have to set something like preserve unknown fields. And if you don't do that, then we assume that any additional field is a mistake, essentially. And we would validate this. So essentially, if you set preserve unknown fields, then we accept additional fields. If you don't set it, then you get a validation error. And there's a nuance here. We would actually return validation error. Kubernetes CRDs, they're just dropping those fields and you don't even know as a user. And I think that's not a good idea. So our behavior would be that we return errors in that case. So that's, in my opinion, or that's the target behavior that I would suggest. And the follow-up discussion is how do we get there, of course, because if we just change it right now, it's kind of a breaking change because folks who already rely on that, they suddenly get a different behavior with 1.2 or whenever we implement it. Can you scroll down to the end? So I think overall migration options are first version, that's the breaking one. We just introduce that preserve unknown fields. I mean, the name is TBD, of course, of that thing, but that would be the same as in CRDs. But we just introduce a preserve unknown fields. And at the same time, we add validation so that folks are getting validation errors. So that would be a breaking change, but not an implicit one. You would notice the difference, but it's definitely a breaking change. And that API type is already v1 beta 1. Alternatives are we introduce preserve unknown fields now with the next release so that folks can already start defining their variables correctly. And then we introduce the validation later on. And later on could be 1.3 or it could be v1 beta 2 or whatever our next API version is. Yeah, that's all I want to tell. If
Great.
someone wants to answer, it's
Any
fine. Otherwise,
comments?
please take a look and answer the issue.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Next, we have Furkat. Are you here? I'm happy to screen share this issue. You want to talk through this?
Yeah, yeah, sure. Hi everyone. Just a background on this issue. We have a scenario where we want to scale out workers and perform an upgrade, and so that with the current behavior of the machine deployment, we end up triggering the rollout upgrade, which results in reprovisioning of the current worker nodes, and that's a bit of expensive operation in some environments, especially in bare metal. So what we were thinking would be nice to have is a possibility so that whenever we scale out and perform an upgrade, machine deployment would not be touching the existing worker nodes at all, while all the newly created worker nodes would be using the desired Kubernetes version, let's say. So I got some responses from Vince and I don't recall the I think Alberto, sorry if I mistakenly pronounced your name, so that we could have maybe a separate controller to handle this use case. But what we were thinking is maybe we could have like basic in place kind of upgrade controller so that we don't touch the existing machines anymore, at least like regarding the Kubernetes version, but ensure that the new machines are according to the new specs. So I just wanted to take this up for your attention and wanted to know your other folks' opinions or suggestions on this, and if you could agree on the possible way to cover this use case.
Well, thanks for writing so clearly, Yassine.
Yeah, I think that use case wise, there's definitely there's definitely some use cases here, especially at the edge. Although I don't think that cluster API wise, that we should have this in the core, but rather probably enable just enough of capability so that folks can plug in their own management in terms of upgrade. Because if we start to put in too much things into the core, things might get hard to manage.
Alberto, did you want to add something?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I pretty much agree with that. I think this is definitely a valid use case, like for bare metal environments. Most of the time, you don't want to recreate machines, right? You want to have a way to apply in-place upgrades. I agree with Yassine as well. Something that we probably don't want to support end-to-end in core copy, but hopefully we can discuss and explore options to enable the use case. So also so you can achieve part of it today by using only machine sets without machine deployments on top of it. But there is not clear contract on how you will be able to plug in an external controller that will handle like the in-place upgrades in a rollout fashion. So yeah, I think we should discuss in that issue, keep the discussion there, and see explore ways to enable the use case.
Okay, cool. Did we have sufficient discussion for this? Any follow-up remarks?
Sure. Thanks for inputs. Yeah, let's discuss then. Follow up on the issue, and hopefully we can get to the point where we can start implementing something. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks again. All right, moving along. Thank you for taking notes again, Fabrizio. Vince wants to ask about KubeCon Contributor Summit. Vince?
Yeah, I was wondering if folks here are going to KubeCon. We don't have to say it here, but we could talk on Slack about it. It would be great to know or just to meet. I think there is a bunch of informal sessions and the Contributor Summit, so we could do another one. I'm personally got approved yesterday, so that's great. I think Fabrizio is going from VMware, but yeah, feel free to reach out if we want to meet somewhere.
Cool, great call out. All right, so I see Jacob is willing to risk it and go at the very end. So I'll take that at face value and move to the provider updates, and then we'll circle back if we have time. So the first on this list is, I'm sorry if I can't, if the acronym friendly readout of this is butchered, but CapOCI. This looks like an announcement that the Slack channel is live and there's a monthly office hours. So thanks for making that announcement. Joe, do you want to, if you're here, Joe, do you want to add anything else?
Nope, you nailed everything. And the only other thing, I think we're going to have a release later this week or early next week. So a release bump, I'm sorry.
Great. Okay, so here's an announcement for CapZ. Cecile has been managing a PR to get Matt Boersma maintainer status, well-deserved, Matt. And we are actively experimenting using Helm to install Out-of-Tree Cloud Provider. That's a lot of fun. I've been doing that work. Cecile, do you want to add anything? Oh, and the async is a big announcement too. So go ahead, I'll give it to you.
Yeah, no, just that most of our Azure services are now refactored to be asynchronous. So that's been a journey over a few months, and with crowdsourcing, and special thanks to Jonathan Tong and Cheyenne, who have been helping with that effort.
Yeah, and welcome, Matt, to your deserved place as a maintainer in the short term. If any folks in other provider communities are interested in the Helm gesture to install add a tree cloud provider or CNI or things of that nature, please hit me up on Slack. I've been in that world for a while now. All right, CapG. Winnie is announcing that CapG is starting an office hour on the first Thursday of each month. And the first meeting is tomorrow at 10. I think PDT stands for daylight time, so long as we have it. Is that right?
Yeah, that's good.
Pacific. Cool. Yeah, Winnie, the floor is yours. Go for it.
Yeah, no, you got everything right. CapG has been pretty quiet provider, but we are actually starting office hour starting tomorrow. So come and join us.
Great, thank you for the call out. And Kappa has a release announcement. 1.4.0 has been released. And it looks like cluster class is going to become a first class member of the end-to-end test suite there. So that's great. If anybody from Kappa wants to make a quick shout out, feel free. All right. So that is provider updates. Last chance for any provider to add an announcement or unmute and say hi. Otherwise, we'll go back up and talk about the IPAM proposal.
Yeah, I hope my sound is not too terrible.
It is actually slightly terrible. Let's maybe, it's really low.
Okay, then.
No, that's a little bit better, I think.
Okay, yeah, then I'll just speak louder. Which is
yeah, that might work. Sorry about that,
try
but go ahead.
Turn up the volume a bit.
Oh, that sounds a lot better, actually.
Okay, good, great. Yeah, the slider was a little bit down. So since we have time left, there was a lot of discussion on the IPAM proposal in the last few weeks by now again, I think. But I feel like the scope is getting larger now, or folks want to increase the scope of the proposal, because the initial idea of the proposal was just to enable integration with IPAM systems, because with the current state of cluster API, that's not really possible, since machines are created automatically and you will need to request IP addresses per machine. And now people are talking about IP address pools and integrating it with cluster class and so on, which actually wasn't the initial idea of the proposal, which is only about enabling that single step or that single integration, which is requesting IP addresses for machines, because that's something that you can't do right now. Everything else, assigning pools, for example, to a cluster, can be done with external automation, because you can just, when creating the cluster, pass it in as a variable, for example. So my idea would be, with what the proposal currently covers, that if you want to allocate subnets for a cluster, for example, you do that with some external automation for now, create a matching pool, then reference the pool from your cluster, from the remaining cluster definition files, and then allocate IP addresses that way. If you want to include more things, for example, allocating pools from a larger pool of addresses, or I don't know, maybe we can do a separate iteration or another iteration on that IPAM proposal and add things later, similar to how cluster class handles things. Because right now I think it's getting bigger and bigger, but covering the basics might be enough as a first.
Fabricio, you are up.
Yeah, I think that this is a fair ask to keep the proposal scoped, and so we were. I saw a thread in Slack that started by Yassine to get a deep dive meeting on this proposal. I suggest that we take this opportunity, go through what people are asking, decide what. At least what we have to do is that to keep track of these asks as a future goal, if we consider them reasonable, and to make sure that we are not doing nothing to prevent this to be implemented. But I agree, it is fair to keep the scope of a proposal limited so we can start to execute as soon as possible. So it is important to keep track and be sure to not do anything against other requests.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else want to chime in? It sounds like Jakob, one takeaway is to maybe set up a dedicated discussion with folks interested in this to try to figure out how to downscope this.
Yeah, I thought just the idea just was to maybe if we can agree on something quickly to do it in here, so we don't have to do a separate meeting. But yeah, we can also do a deep dive and think more about future use cases to avoid limiting things. Then we'll just organize a separate meeting.
Well, this is the last agenda item. I'm open if other folks are to stick around if you want to ask some pointed questions that might help during this meeting resolve some of the scoping issues. But it's certainly a non-trivial problem.
Yes, it is. So if folks are fine with that, maybe if you scroll all the way down, there's one comment from Vince, for example. Like way down.
Yeah, I'm now becoming acquainted with the the complexity here. Okay,
Yes.
so we talking right here?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So
Also in
here, for
chat, it looks
example-
like Vince may have dropped, but please.
I'm still here. I just have like another minute and then I have to hop. But yeah, so like I made this comment because like while reading through the proposal, this seems like something that these types like don't even hold any information or any like don't have any useful meaning within cluster API. Usually when we did that in the past, like it was going to be something referenced like but like my point here was more like, should we flip the model so that like the IP pool and all these IP pools like can work together and then integrate with other IPAMs to get allocated. And also have like an entry implementation that like it could be used without any other implementation as well. So that was kind of like more like the provider model I had in mind. It was like more kind of like opt-in and optional, and but yeah, we can talk about it like in a one-off meeting as well.
Yeah, then if you have to leave, then let's do that. We just have to find a slot.
Well, certainly to whomever is managing this ongoing thread, much credit goes. This looks like a lot of work put in, so.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jakob. I think we are at, we have no more agenda items. Any last remarks from folks? You can get 13 minutes back. All right, great. When the recording download drops, I might bug some folks to clarify how to upgrade to the right or upload to the right YouTube destinations, et cetera, et cetera.
Thanks.
That's Wednesday. Have a nice day,
Bye.
folks.
For hosting, Jack.
Later.
Pleasure.